50 years is a long time for a truth to stay buried, long enough for a child to become a woman, long enough for grief to grow old, and long enough for even the loudest memories to learn silence. The Bennett house stood at the end of Cedar Lane, painted white, window frames fading, porch wood breathing with age. People called it charming, but charm is just the mask old stories wear to avoid being questioned. Nora Bennett never knew this house carried her beginning. She thought her story started somewhere far simpler, in a small public library between bookshelves taller than her curiosity, in a life that felt safe but strangely incomplete. But completeness isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet knock on a door you never expected to open. The envelope arrived on a winter morning in 2025. The paper was thin, yellow, and slightly warped from time, like it had survived seasons it wasn't built to endure. The ink had softened, but the intention had not. Letters usually carry messages. This one carried a life. It was written in 1975, sealed in 1975, meant to be delivered in 1975, and yet it traveled half a century to reach the hands it was destined for. Not early, not on time, but finally. The words on the front simply read, "For Nora, when you're ready." Ready is a dangerous word, because ready means the past believes you're strong enough now to survive the thing that once could have destroyed you. The letter inside was not long, but it was heavy. The kind of heavy that doesn't weigh your hands, only your identity. It told a story about a summer she never remembered, a promise she never knew she carried, and a choice her mother made that the world was never supposed to witness. It revealed that her birth certificate had once carried a different name, a different origin, and a different fate. The world had known Nora Bennett for decades, but the world had met her second version, not the first. Her mother, Rose Bennett, had been a woman who believed love was fragile and that the world could be cruel to fragile things. She believed that some lives needed to be edited before being published into reality. So she edited hers, or at least she thought she did. The letter explained that Nora was born in 1970, not in Oregon like her documents claimed, but in a coastal town in Maine during a storm that flooded not just streets but decisions. Rose was only 19 at the time. Alone, terrified, holding a newborn she didn't believe she was prepared to raise in a world that had already begun feeling too sharp for soft hearts. She wrote in the letter that there was a man once. A man whose last goodbye smelled like gasoline, train tracks, and unfulfilled futures. A man who left for war and returned only in postcards that carried everything except presence. And presence is the one thing grief can never substitute. So Rose made a decision. Not out of betrayal, not out of selfishness, but out of fear, wearing the costume of love. She placed Nora into the arms of a trusted couple, the Whitemans, who had been waiting years for a child to call their home whole. Rose convinced herself that this was rescue, not abandonment. The Whiteman raised her as Nora Bennett Whiteman for 3 years, a gentle name for a gentle life, a beginning that felt warm and intentional. But warmth can blur truth's edges, and truth never likes staying blurred forever. In 1973, Rose returned. Not healed, not certain, but older by pain and regret, which sometimes masquerade as clarity. She asked for her daughter back, believing bloodlines should not be outsourced permanently, no matter how noble the excuse. The Whiteman agreed, but only with a condition. The transition must never fracture the child. No courtroom, no police, no official noise, just a quiet handover of motherhood. Because noise attracts judgment, and judgment attracts separation. So Rose created new documents. A new town, a new backstory, a new birth record, not to deceive the child, but to protect the world from interfering with the reunion. She rewrote the official beginning, and the government registry accepted it because the 1970s were full of administrative shadows where paperwork rarely asked emotional follow-up questions. From that day, Nora Bennett's life restarted. Officially, but restarts don't delete the old save file, they only hide it deeper. For 50 years, Rose kept the truth folded into envelopes, journals, and locked drawers, not out of shame, but because shame usually speaks. Rose's silence was grief, guilt, and protection braided into one language. Nora grew up feeling slightly misaligned with her own timeline, like she had arrived in a life that fit her but not perfectly. The kind of imperfection you can't prove, only feel. She spent decades surrounded by stories and books, but none felt personal enough to fill the hollow curiosity she carried about her own prologue. Some people chase family trees. Nora spent her life shelving them. But now the tree had come to her. The letter revealed one more thing, a detail sharper than the rest. That her original identity wasn't just misplaced, it was overlapping. because Rose discovered in 1974 that the Whiteman had a daughter too, born 2 months after they adopted Nora. A biological child they named Evelyn Whiteman. 2 daughters existed in the same emotional coordinates, one by blood, one by accident, one by adoption. One by return, both unaware that their life files once touched in the same folder, when Rose reclaimed Nora. The registry system accidentally merged the identities of both girls in county records for a short period before being manually corrected. But corrections were not clean. Registry ink bled. Somewhere in old Maine County archives, Nora's early identity still carried fragments of Evelyn's official existence. A bureaucratic glitch that no one realized was building emotional destiny. Evelyn Whiteman grew up separately, unaware of the sisterhood that almost existed. She moved to California in 1995, became a journalist, married, built a public life that shined far brighter than administrative shadows. And ironically, it was Evelyn's investigative work in 2024 that accidentally triggered a digitization of old undelivered letters in USPS archival recovery drives, one of which was the letter that reached Nora in 2025, 50 years later. A postal restoration project triggered by someone else's career returned the very key Rose once tried to bury. The letter was not a bridge. It was a map that led to a family line she never knew crossed hers, a sisterhood that almost existed, and a mother's decision that was made in fear but preserved in love. Sometimes the story you think is yours was just holding space for the story that was always meant to find you later. Nora didn't just open a letter that day. She opened a timeline correction the universe had been shipping for 50 years. Because some deliveries aren't late, they're intentional. And this one was just beginning. The moment a long-hidden truth comes into the light, life stops feeling like a straight line. It starts feeling like evidence. Nora Bennett wasn't someone who ever imagined her own existence would require footnotes. Yet now, the footnotes were demanding the main chapter. The letter had revealed a different beginning, a reclaimed identity, and a postal mistake that altered more than an address. It altered a life, but a revelation is never the end, it's the signal flare. After reading the letter, Nora did not run to a laptop, she ran to history. The first place she turned to was the U.S. Postal Archive Museum, a quiet brick building in Washington, D.C., where retired workers, old mailbags, and undelivered stories were preserved behind glass. People visited it for nostalgia. Nora visited it for lineage. She had no reason to believe her answer would be sitting there, cataloged like a public artifact. And yet, sometimes truth hides in places too obvious to suspect. The museum curator had once said in an interview, "We don't store mail. We store moments." Nora finally understood what that meant. The postal restoration program that digitized old letters in 2024 had triggered a wave of archive openings across the country. Thousands of envelopes were scanned, logged, and preserved. Most contained ordinary words. A few contained life sentences, and one contained Nora. Because Calvin Reed's mistake was not the only anomaly in the system. It was the first domino. The Bennett and Whiteman names had crossed paths in 1973 due to an administrative registry merge, a glitch that lasted only weeks but echoed for decades. But glitches don't vanish. They fossilize. The county office in Maine that once logged the brief identity overlap between Nora Bennett and Evelyn Whiteman had been digitized as part of a nationwide archival transparency project. The records were not erased. They were migrated into permanence. The file simply read, Identity Merge Case 1973-4 Whitman Bennett, corrected, not deleted, not deleted. That phrase hit harder than the truth itself. For 50 years, Nora believed she was just a librarian's daughter raised in a quiet Oregon home. The world believed that too, but the archive believed something different. And archives never apologize for accuracy. The file contained hospital timestamps, adoption transfer forms, handwritten middle name edits, and a single memo written by a young registry officer who noticed the merge but didn't understand its emotional gravity at the time. It said, "One child reclaimed, one child biological, names crossed, lives did not, correction filed, origin unchanged in backup logs." Backup logs, the attic had been her emotional archive. This was the governmental one. The moment a person realizes there are two versions of their history, the one they lived and the one that was recorded, identity stops being a feeling. It becomes a negotiation. But Nora wasn't negotiating, she was collecting. She learned that Evelyn Whiteman, the other girl whose identity briefly overlapped hers, had no idea she was part of this administrative crossroads. Evelyn never knew there was a sisterhood that almost existed in paperwork but never made it into the real world. She also learned something far more painful, that Evelyn had died in 2022 during a wildfire evacuation in Northern California. A journalist who spent her life uncovering truths for others never knew she was connected to one that involved herself. Truth hunters rarely expect to be hunted by truth. The archive didn't just reveal a mistake. It revealed the cost of it. Nora didn't know Evelyn, but she grieved her instantly. Because grief doesn't require memories, it only requires meaning. Evelyn wasn't her sister by blood. But she was her sister by almost existence, by misfiled legacy, by a postal worker's guilt, and by a mother's impossible choice in a different decade. And sometimes, almost family hurts more than family because you never got the chance to love it in real time. The archive included photos too. Scanned evidence from county files showing young Rose Bennett holding baby Nora and separately the Whiteman couple holding their newborn Evelyn in a different folder. Both photos stamped April 1973. Same county. Same ink, different destinies. The universe has a strange sense of humor. It lets two stories run parallel for decades, then reveals they once touched but never met. And when stories touch but don't meet, the impact is delayed but not diminished. Nora realized the attic wasn't a hiding place. It was a waiting room. Her mother didn't destroy the truth. She postponed its confrontation until Nora was emotionally armored enough to survive it. Rose Bennett believed love sometimes means controlling the timing of pain, but timing can be misread. And love can be misdelivered too. Calvin Reed didn't just lose the Hale letter in a storm, he lost a batch of envelopes that day. One Hale letter mistakenly reached the Bennett home. Another Whiteman letter mistakenly entered county files, and the corrections were made manually, not cleanly, leaving a hairline crack in the archival foundation. And cracks are where light enters. The archive revealed a second envelope had once been logged as returned to sender in 1973, addressed to Rose Bennett, but signed by someone with the initials MH. The contents were never scanned, the letter was never opened, the initials were never traced. And now the envelope was officially marked, stored in Cold Archive Unit 9, Undelivered Personal Mail Recovery. Unit 9 was not open to the public. It required authorization from a family member or legal descendant. For the first time, Nora qualified for a door that was never built for her. She filed the request not as a daughter, but as evidence. Because some doors don't open for emotion, they open for eligibility. Her application was accepted within 3 hours, not because the system was kind, but because the system was finally correct. The letter would be retrieved from cold storage, desealed, and scanned. The content would be displayed exactly as written in 1973. No edits, no rewrites, no protective silence. 50 years after the world almost merged two daughters, it was now merging the truth with the right recipient. Nora didn't know what MH stood for. She didn't know if it was love, betrayal, regret, or warning. But she knew one thing, that the second letter wasn't coming to rewrite her past. It was coming to reveal why the past was rewritten in the first place. When the second letter was finally pulled from Cold Archive Unit 9, Nora didn't feel excitement. She felt consequence. Because curiosity asks questions, but truth answers them without permission. The letter was scanned in a secure postal digitization room, a place where confidentiality lives behind locked terminals and red-stamped clearance badges. The kind of place where ordinary citizens never get invited, yet here she was, not by ambition but by inheritance. The moment the file loaded, the past exhaled. The handwriting was her mother's. But the signature wasn't. The letter began with a sentence that sounded like surrender trying to whisper. I gave you a life that wasn't yours to carry, not poetic, not gentle, just accurate. The kind of accuracy that breaks with precision instead of drama. The letter explained that the Hale envelope was not the only thing Calvin misdelivered in 1970. He also misdelivered a name. In 1970, when Rose Bennett was rushed into St. Harbor Medical Center during a hurricane night, she was registered under a temporary emergency intake list because the town was half evacuated and the hospital was running on generators, exhaustion, and crisis protocol. Temporary lists save lives. They don't preserve identity, That night, another young woman, Mara Hale, was also admitted, a Red Cross volunteer injured while helping families relocate. Her paperwork was clipped to the same intake stack as Rose's. The storm didn't care about boundaries, alphabet, or ownership. And when the storm scattered documents, a name meant for Mara was accidentally attached to Nora. That's how Nora received Hale, not from a love story, not from bloodline, but from a hurricane's indifference and a postal worker's error that reached further than mail. Calvin Reed thought he lost letters that night. He never knew he also lost identities. Rose Bennett discovered the name Merge only in 1974 when she tried to enroll young Nora into elementary school. The registrar paused, frowned, and said, "Your daughter's file shows Hale origin. You're Bennett." Bennett was her mother's truth. Hale was her daughter's paperwork. Rose didn't choose Hale. She chose not to fight it. She wrote that she believed the universe was offering her daughter a shield, a stronger surname echo that sounded braver than Bennett, a name that might soften the edges of a world Rose herself couldn't face at 19. But names don't shield identity. They borrow it, and borrowed identities collect interest. Mara Hale, the original owner of the name fragment, had no idea her identity splinter once carried a baby she never met. She left Maine in 1976, moved to Arizona, built disaster relief programs, trained volunteers, saved thousands of lives, and became the kind of woman newspapers describe with words like heroic, tireless, unstoppable, the kind of woman who never checks an attic for her own name. Mara Hale died in 2019 peacefully at 74, surrounded by volunteers who once learned rescue from her hands. The world gave her applause, the archive gave her a footnote she never read. Nora wasn't related to Evelyn, she wasn't related to Jonathan, and she wasn't related to Mara Hale either. But for 50 years her paperwork made the world treat her like she might be. And sometimes the world treats paperwork better than people. The second letter didn't just explain the origin of a name. It explained the origin of Rose's silence. She stayed silent not because she feared judgment, though she did, but because she feared correction. Correction would trigger questions. Questions would trigger audits. Audits would trigger separation. And separation was the one storm she knew she couldn't survive twice. So she sealed the truth in envelopes instead of courtrooms, because 1970s America could handle hurricanes. It didn't know how to handle women reclaiming identities from adoption records and clerical merges without attracting interference. But 2025 America runs on digitization, verification, ancestry kits, facial recognition at airports, and online family tree obsessions that promise connection but rarely prepare you for contradiction. The contradiction was this. Nora Bennett had lived 50 years carrying a name that belonged to a storm, not a family. And the emotional hook was this: the name she carried connected her to people she never met but almost met but never knew she was missing. Some people grow up wondering who they belong to. Nora grew up wondering why belonging never felt like it belonged to her. And now she knew why. Because belonging without truth feels like a library with no home aisle full of stories but none labeled personal. The letter ended with a sentence that sounded like apology, finally learning honesty. "I hope you forgive me for the silence, even if you can't forgive the reason for it." Nora didn't cry immediately. She didn't break immediately. She did something quieter, braver, and far more terrifying for the past. She smiled, not a happy smile, a timeline correction smile, the kind that says, "I survived the chapter you thought would end me." Nora always believed a name was something you inherit. Something given. Something permanent, but permanence is a luxury only the untested get to keep. After the second letter surfaced from cold storage, her identity stopped feeling like a biography and started feeling like a puzzle the universe refused to let her abandon. The archive had told her the mechanics of the mistake: a storm, a stack of emergency intake forms, and a surname fragment that never belonged to her bloodline but somehow still followed her life like an unpaid invoice. But mechanics explain the how. They never soothed the why, and the why was louder than the storm itself. Nora traveled to Phoenix, Arizona because the 1990 archive tag carried a breadcrumb. Bennett Hale mail incident follow-up, unresolved. It was unresolved not because it was unsolvable, it was unresolved because no one ever realized there was a person at the center of the error. Someone was always meant to read the file. But no one knew who, until Nora qualified for the door by simply existing long enough. The Postal Museum records hinted that the Whiteman family had once filed a trace believing a Hale-signed batch of mail intersected their family line decades earlier. It was never about adoption, it was about curiosity, genealogy, and administrative coincidence. Clara Whiteman, now 68, was the genealogist who filed the original trace. She had built her life studying lineage, but never suspected lineage was studying her work back. Nora found Clara's old archival scrapbook in a volunteer heritage thrift store that stored donated relief memorabilia. The desert preserves dust better than paper, but paper better than memory. The page from 1990 still carried a photocopy of the Hale's signature initials MH with a question mark beside them and a note, names crossed. Lives did not, but stories sometimes meet later. Stories meet later, that sentence finally felt personal, because later had arrived, and it arrived in a middle-aged woman who spent her life shelving stories instead of starring in them. Clara never met Mara Hale. She never met Jonathan Hale, and she never met Nora Bennett either. But her archival request unknowingly authenticated the very glitch that would one day rewrite Nora's origin story. The world didn't merge their lives. The archive merged their metadata. And metadata has a strange power in the modern age. It doesn't prove love, but it proves connection's possibility. For decades, Nora walked through life believing her story was quiet because it lacked spectacle. She never realized it was quiet because the past actively filed her under almost family, not real family. Almost family doesn't introduce itself, it leaves a trace and hopes you never look too closely. But time mailed her the magnifying glass anyway. She dug deeper into Maine County digitized registry backups. Because archives are honest even when people aren't. The backups showed that Nora's name file had once carried Evelyn Whitman's identity fragments for a few weeks in 1973 before being manually separated into different life lanes. The separation was recorded, but the collision was still preserved in system backups tagged under Hale Batch Intake Spillover. The collision didn't hurt in 1973. It hurt in 2025. Because pain is rarely punctual, truth is, the more she read, the more she realized her life had been living in the margin of someone else's delivery error. Not intentionally, not maliciously, not romantically, just bureaucratically. And bureaucratic tragedy is a special kind of cruel because no villain can be blamed for it. The villain was a storm. And storms can't be summoned for accountability hearings. But something else could. The letter batch that Calvin Reed dropped during the 1970 hurricane wasn't just personal mail. It was a military outbound promise stack processed through USPS emergency dispatch units near Maine coast bases. And inside that stack were 3 life-changing letters. 1. Jonathan Hale's love letter meant for Evelyn. 2. Rose Bennett's identity reclamation letter. 3. And 1 final Hale envelope meant for someone who never received it in 1973 either. The third envelope carried the signature initials MH but wasn't Jonathan. Wasn't Mara, wasn't Evelyn. It belonged to a woman named Margaret Hawthorne, a military nurse who served beside Jonathan Hale and once signed discharge paperwork for injured Red Cross volunteers, including Mara Hale, in 1970 intake corridors. Her letter wasn't romantic, it was a promise of guardianship. It read, "If the storm separates us, make sure the child still gets a future." The child wasn't Evelyn, the child was Nora, but the storm did separate them. And the future never got delivered until 2025. Margaret Hawthorne never knew the letter was misfiled. She assumed someone higher in the military stack ensured guardianship protocol. The military assumed USPS ensured delivery. USPS assumed the county registry ensured correction. The county registry assumed school enrollment would expose issues. School enrollment assumed parents confirmed origin. Parents assumed archives were closed. And archives assumed no one would ever ask. Everyone assumed someone else carried responsibility. And assumption is how truth gets stored for 50 years. Nora realized she wasn't the intended daughter of a love letter. But she was the intended daughter of a promise that guaranteed a future even if family lines snapped. Her entire life was an answered prayer she never prayed herself. She walked out of the thrift store holding the 1990 scrapbook photocopy. The desert wind didn't scatter the page, it steadied it. Because she wasn't running anymore. For the first time, Nora Bennett wasn't just a name misfile, she was the final recipient the archive was always waiting to authorize. Not because she chased the truth, but because the truth was finally digitized enough to chase her. 50 years later, a single envelope arrived to finish a job no one realized was still open. Nora Bennett had spent decades believing that a life without roots was still a life worth living. But she never knew her life did have roots. They were just growing in someone else's name. The final letter was not romantic. It was not gentle, it was foundational. It came from a military nurse named Margaret Hawthorne, a woman whose entire life was built on saving others before saving herself. The archive revealed that Margaret wrote her letter the same night the Hale and Bennett paperwork collided in 1970 during a hurricane emergency intake at St. Harbor Medical Center in Maine. Margaret was 23 at the time, stationed at the nearby Coastal Base Hospital Extension Unit. She assisted the county intake officer that night when injured Red Cross volunteers were admitted in waves. One of those volunteers was Mara Hale. Another was a frightened 19-year-old new mother, Rose Bennett. Margaret never knew Rose personally, but she noticed the newborn in her arms as files scattered, lights flickered, and the world was running on adrenaline instead of documentation. She saw a child born in chaos. And chaos-born children always need a promise. So Margaret made one, not in court, not in adoption papers, not in government files, but in ink. If the storm separates us, make sure the child still gets a future. She assumed the system would carry it forward. The system assumed someone else was carrying it. And that is how responsibility becomes a relay race no one remembers entering. When the hurricane passed, the names were manually corrected. But the letters were misplaced in cold postal storage. The truth was postponed into obscurity, and obscurity is where stories become immortal. Nora grew up under the surname Bennett, raised in Oregon, surrounded by books, not clues. But identity doesn't live in the name you speak. It lives in the name the universe keeps trying to return to you, and the universe had been trying to return Hale to her for 50 years. Not Hale the family, but Hale the promise. Jonathan Hale never met Nora. He never knew the name fragment attached to her file. His letter belonged to Evelyn. Evelyn's life ended in 2022. Mara Hale's life ended in 2019. Margaret Hawthorne's life ended in 2018 after 40-plus years of disaster relief service, humanitarian field training, and volunteer medical deployment. The world honored Margaret with medals, citations, newspaper features, and national disaster relief acknowledgments. But the archive honored her with accuracy, and accuracy is the one tribute time never decorates, it just delivers. The 1990 archive follow-up file was triggered by Clara Whiteman, a genealogist who never knew her investigation would one day authenticate Nora's life intersection. But intersection doesn't require awareness, only traceability. And traceability was the passport Nora finally received in 2025. Nora didn't feel anger anymore, because anger needs a human villain. And this story had none. It had only humans trying to survive systems trying to survive storms. And storms can't testify in accountability hearings. Nora stood at the memorial wall in Phoenix where volunteer medical responders honored Mara Hale. A wall built with names carved into metal, stronger than paper, stronger than storms. Strong enough for truth, she placed her hand over Margaret Hawthorne's memorial plaque, and for the first time in her life, Nora didn't feel like a woman holding someone else's legacy. She felt like a woman finally meeting the reason her legacy survived at all. She realized that life is not always shaped by introductions. Sometimes it is shaped by interruptions, and interruptions are not always tragedies. Some interruptions are reroutes, and reroutes are not always delays. Some reroutes are protection disguised as accident. The final letter did not rewrite her childhood. It validated it. It validated every quiet moment she thought was emptiness. Every hollow question she never asked out loud. Every library aisle she walked through searching for belonging without realizing belonging was filed under her name in a different state, a different decade, and a different postal bag. She walked out of the archive room holding the final scanned copy of the letter, not to archive it again but to close the case emotionally, not administratively. She whispered a sentence into the wind. A sentence no one else heard but the story heard perfectly. I forgive the silence. But I honor the timing. And timing smiled back, because timing was the real author of her survival. That day Nora Bennett didn't gain a new family reunion. She gained the reason a reunion was never required for her to survive. Some letters carry words, some carry confessions, some carry love, But the rarest letters, they don't deliver a story. They deliver the person who was always supposed to read it when the world was finally ready to protect the truth instead of protect the secret. 50 years later, the letter changed everything, not by correcting her past, but by proving her past never needed correction. It only needed delivery, and delivery finally happened.